So first, I want to welcome you on behalf of Rabbi Roli Matala and Rabbi Shuli Passau, who are here together with me, as well as Rabbi Becca Weintraub, who I don't think is here right now, to this important conversation, which we've been waiting to, actually, we've been in process of this conversation for a very long time. It's not a new conversation, certainly not a new conversation for our country. It's not a new conversation for the Jewish community. And it's not a new conversation to BJ, but we are really, as a community, wrestling with the questions of what does bitachon mean? Bitachon in Hebrew means security, and it also means trust. From a perspective of, if you think in the tradition of Musar, which is the pietistic tradition, trust is the ability to walk and serve with the sense of purpose and safety and a sense of freedom to walk in the ways of the way you see your sense of serving God. Bitachon is also means security, and excuse my dog, who is very loyal and tries to be securing my apartment here. In Israel, you'll see people have the word bitachon on them. That's security, and in a sense to kind of create what is perceived or what feels as a secure environment. Both of these notions of security are deeply important to us at BJ. That one, we are in a secure place that no one who's dangerous can enter. We know that the Jewish people historically has been targeted, and not just historically in our time. We don't have to look too far back to experience that, whether it's in our city or in our country. And at the same time, we know that the sense of walking into a place, a home, a sanctuary of worship, a religious community and building, we want everyone to feel that they have the internal bitachon, the ability to feel safe and secure and serve their purpose and be seen for who they are without a sense of being questioned or asked whether they belong. And the recognition is that all these notions of bitachon really matter. All the notions of what it means to feel safe and secure really matter, and that we as a Jewish community, given the diversity of our community, of all kinds of people, all sexual orientations, all ethnicities, all colors of skin and race and purpose, that we want everyone to feel a part of that. And then depending on who's at the door, sometimes that feels more or less the truth. And at the same time, we are also responsible for protecting everyone who is in our building, and that we know that there are folks out there who are not, there are lots of people who want to threaten the Jewish community and want to threaten our sense of safety and security. And we don't want to have to choose one or the other, which is the way often these conversations take place. Either you side with what are considered a certain version of bitachon, which are police or security firms, or you side with the sense of we want to understand the diversity of the community and not everyone feels comfortable, and we're being asked to choose sides. At BJ, we don't want to have to choose sides, and we're wrestling with the complexity of this issue, which is complex. And therefore, tonight we've gathered an incredible panel to have a really honest and thoughtful and holy conversation that we hope will be one of many conversations in our community about what safety truly means for each of us and what collective safety and security really means. Knowing that our lived experience is really different, each and every one of us. And when we say those words, we imagine something really different depending on our lived experience as a person. And so tonight I'm really honored on behalf of our whole community and leadership to welcome our panelists and our moderators. So I'd just like to introduce them. Their bios very extensive bios, because they have a lot of wisdom and a lot of experience, are on our website. So I'm not going to go through all the details of their wonderful stories and work and their own sense of service to the community. But tonight I'd like to welcome, as our moderator, Rabbi Jill Jacobs, who is the CEO of Truah, the Rabbinic Call for Human Rights, an organization that trains and mobilizes more than 2,000 rabbis and cantors and their communities to bring a moral voice to protecting and advancing human rights in North America and in the occupied Palestinian territories. I'm also really happy to welcome, or say welcome home, to Lindsay Newman, who is the Director of Community Engagement at the Lashon, an organization that advocates for the racial, ethnic, and cultural diversity of the Jewish community, and is also one of the co-authors of Not Free to Desist, an open letter challenging the Jewish community to reimagine its commitment to racial justice. Lindsay also grew up at BJ. And we'd also like to welcome Rabbi Rabbi Susan Talve, who is the founding rabbi of Central Reform Synagogue in St. Louis, and has an incredible bio, just like our other panelists, as well as Deborah Lauter, who's the director of the New York City Office for the Prevention of Hate Crimes. So welcome to everyone. Thank you to all our panelists for being a part of this very holy and important conversation. And I'll now turn it over to Jill, Rabbi Jill Jacobs.
Thank you so much, Felicia. Thank you to all of the rabbis, Rabbi Felicia and Shuli and Rolly, for organizing this conversation. It's really nice to be here with the BJ community. And it's a perfect moment to be having this conversation as we're in the parsha where the Israelites are actually getting out of Mitzrayim and trying to do this really hard thing together, namely move toward liberation and trying to form a new community, which was not easy then, and it's still not easy to try to figure out how all of these different people can be together in community. And so I'm really glad to be part of that conversation here at BJ. So I want to start by asking the members of our panel for some definitions. So when we talk about safety and security, sometimes we might be in a conversation where two people are saying safety and security, but actually have totally different definitions and don't realize they're not talking about the same thing. So I want to just ask you for definitions. What to you is security? What do you mean when you say security? What do you mean when you say safety? And what does it mean for our Jewish community to feel safe and secure? And what does it mean for all of us to feel safe and secure within a Jewish community? So I'm just going to call on people as I see you, and then I'll switch it up. So I'm going to call on Rabbi Susan, then Deborah, and then Lindsay.
Well, I loved Felicia's introduction of bitachon and the idea of trust. After our conversation the other day, one of the things that I remembered from our struggle with this here in St. Louis, and granted, St. Louis is very different than New York. I do want to say that I never felt as safe anywhere. I tell this to people all the time as I did living on the Upper West Side, because people are, at least when I lived there many years ago, people were in your business. It's kind of like in Israel. So when I would be walking home late at night, it was the bartender on the corner that would say, make sure you get home safely. And it was like I knew the neighborhood. Here, where people live a little bit more spread out, it's different. It's different. People aren't watching you as much. So what does it mean to be secure, and what does it mean to be safe? The conversation that we had, 2014, was a big change for us when Michael Brown was murdered. So we really had to struggle with this. Where were we going to stand? What was the line in the sand? And one of the things that we came up with was making a distinction between a shoter and a shomer. We are responsible for the Ashcroft policing post 9/11. He's another Missourian, and that's when policing became, shotrim, the police model of, you are there as a shoter to make the laws, to defend the law, to make sure the law is kept, And so when we decided that we needed some kind of guarding, we decided that we were going to reject the shoter model and we were going to embrace the shomer model. And that for me is the difference. The shomer is someone who brings safety to everyone. The shoter can give you security, but unless you have a shomer who really cares about the whole community and shares your heart and is really there to guard you, body, mind, and soul, then you never really are going to be safe.
Deborah?
So first I want to thank BJ for hosting this. I realized in all my years of dealing with security issues in the Jewish community, I've never had this kind of conversation. So I really want to applaud you for really digging deep into this and struggling with it. It is not an easy issue. When I think of security, for me, the definition is really the protection from external threats. And I think of those in terms of physical protection. And the safety issue is more for me the feeling of being free from those threats, and more it's internal and emotional. So external physical versus internal emotional. That's a distinction. So you can have all the security in the world, right, and still not feel safe. And that's, I think, part of what we're dealing with tonight. Where's that line? How do you struggle with it? Yeah.
Lindsay?
Yeah, it's great to be here back at home in BJ, albeit virtually, to have conversations like this. And I think that this question is really important. And I'm so glad that we're starting off here because, for me, similarly to both Susan and Deborah, the idea of safety and security is wrapped up in both the physical and the emotional and the psychological and the spiritual. And I see that as, that safety and security is being able to have wholeness in my person, in my spiritualness, in my psychological well-being. And I think that when we think about a community, that this is part of a conversation about how do we liberate ourselves as a community, right? Like, how can we show up as our best selves, both as an individual as well as a community, and stand fully in our wholeness.
Thank you. So when we were talking before preparing for this session, there's a value that a number of you articulated, that we should base our security decisions on the needs of the most vulnerable member of our community. But it's not always obvious, maybe to everybody, who the most vulnerable member of our community is. So I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit about how we understand who the most vulnerable member of our community is and what impact that might have on our security decisions. So maybe we'll go backwards this time. So let's do Lindsay, Deborah, and Susan.
Yeah, well, originally when we were having our prep conversation, that idea of, as a community, we can only be as safe and secure as our most vulnerable member. I think that to me relates to, the idea that has been written about by Martin Luther King Jr. Actually, that idea that we are all, reliant on each other, that we're part of this inescapable network of mutuality, that I can only be my best self if you show up as your best self, and if you are liberated to be who you are, that will allow me to be liberated in who I am. And in a lot of the work that I do in, working with organizations to center racial equity specifically, this question is very much about understanding how our systems and how our organizations, how our communal structures have set up, marginalization, have set up methods and ways of perpetuating, disconnection. And how do we understand both belonging, and how do we understand disconnection? So if we're thinking about our community, how do we understand how people experience marginalization in order to counteract that, and in order to be proactive in creating spaces where everyone can show up and feel that they belong. So, in the inspiration for the letter that Felicia referenced in my introduction, the Not Free to Desist letter, which was published in June of 2020, which was essentially this calling to be radical in our imagination of what racial justice could look like for the Jewish community. Thinking about safety and security, we were 3 Jews of color writing that letter, thinking, when we show up in a Jewish space, we are showing up as people of color. I'm showing up in my Black body. And so safety for a Jewish community needs to recognize that and needs to respond to that. And that we are not willing to, make sacrifices for one group in exchange for the safety of someone else, that we have to be more expansive in how we think about and address these issues.
Deborah.
Yeah, so this is a real tough one for me because, Lindsay, I hear you loud and clear, but when it comes to issues of security, I'm not sure that the congregation can only do their planning around those who feel the most vulnerable. I just worry that, where do you take it to the extreme? Does that mean if you don't want to see, and I'm just saying you as just any person, if whether they're a person of color or not, if they don't like police officers, does that mean that the whole congregation should not, should accede to the request not to have police officers? That's why this is so difficult. Is there a way to respect those and come up with solutions? And I'm sure we'll get into that discussion of what those can mean later on. But in the realm of security, for me, kind of making compromises when some threats may be real is not an option at this stage. So how do you respect and accommodate some people without the whole congregation suffering in the realm of security? So
I remember the day. It was 2014, and we had to have security. We had serious threats, and the FBI said, you have to have security. Our local federation said, you have to have security. And we weren't thinking. And in the midst of Ferguson, we got an off-duty police officer, not thinking, just not thinking. And I was there that day. I remember what happened. The off-duty police officer was there because we hired him, and none of our Jews of color could come near the door. They just couldn't approach. I watched them. I said, oh my God, how, of course. You know what? I was triggered by those police officers and they wanted them in uniform and they wanted them with guns. And boy, did we learn a lesson that day. I'll tell you, we learned a big lesson that day, and we went back to the drawing board and we said, how do we do this? How do we do this? There has to be a way. Now, granted, I'm in St. Louis and we have a relationship with the police department. It's not New York City, but one of the things that we did was we put a wonderful guy who was on our board at the time, still on the board, who was a Jew of color, as head of our security committee. So we started a conversation and we said, okay, we're going to have tensions. This is a tense time. Let's have serious, courageous conversations around what's really happening here. Because, as Lindsay said, we have to be part of the solution or we're going to be part of the problem, right? We have to be part of, that's what Ferguson was about, achieving long-term structural change. So we had to figure out, how do we do the and here? How do we have the security and have the safety of our members? And, it took us a while, but what we came up with, and it's not going to work for everybody, but I will tell you, we have a shomer. We have James. We only have security of color. It's a compromise because he's an off-duty police officer. And, there's a police culture that we are working hard to change. But James has become part of our community. He comes to services. He knows, he comes in and meets the children. All the children know his name. So, I mean, it's our solution has been to really develop the Shomer model, kind of like community policing. He gets training, we get training. We're all part of the solution. There's always a member with him, by the way, because again, it's about, one of the things we also know, and I'll stop talking, is profiling doesn't work. When you profile, and there's a wonderful book by a guy named David Harris who wrote Profiles in Injustice. I don't know if you know that book, Deborah. His parents, his in-laws belong to CRC, so I know him well. And it's a great book because he's got the data that shows that all profiling does is it angers the very people who can tell you the good guys from the bad guys. And that has served us well too, because there's a lot of troubling looking white guys, alt-white guys that live on our street that are scary to us. But because we know people, again, it's the bottom line is relationships, going that extra mile to get to know people if you can, because the real safety comes. I mean, we saw that at a time they had a guard, and the poor guy got shot too. So how do we really do this work in a way that doesn't just give us security, but gives us safety? It's about going that extra mile and building in, I think, that Shomer model, really making relationships, having people that become part of your community who are there to serve. I'll just end with so many examples, but we just had a big funeral a week ago, and James found out about it, and he took a day off work. He told his chief, he said, you know what? I got to be at CRC today. And the chief gave him the day off so he could be our guard, because he knew we needed a guard, and he knew that there would be a lot of people of color, and he wanted to be there because he gets it. He gets that we cannot trigger people, and we have to be part of the solution in creative ways today.
Thanks. So I want to get really, Lindsay, go ahead.
Yeah, I think that this is I just want to respond or offer some more thoughts, because I think that the framing now of this conversation is really important as we, jump in here. And I think that idea of, one, understanding that when we say, rethinking security or rethinking safety, I think it's important to realize that we are all invested in everyone feeling safe. So if the solution that we're coming up with is that you're going to feel less safe, or be in actuality less safe or less secure, and that's going to make me more safe, that's not a solution to me. And that's not where we're going. And I think that, a lot of times we can have reactions in this conversation where, there's a lot of assumptions that we're also reacting to. I think that we've also sort of talked around this idea, or maybe not explicitly said it yet, but I think part of this conversation, and particularly in the context of BJ, is about thinking about, what are our different tools and methods of safety. And I know so for many Jewish communities and for many synagogues, that idea of, do we need police to be secure, and in what ways are police showing up? And when, in particular, when writing the Not Free to Desist letter, we were trying to take a step back from that and say, safety and security can exist. What would it look like for safety and security to exist without police? What would it look like? Or if you are engaging, what are the other modes or different components that would need to be true in order to have that security if you are engaging with police. And so I think that point about this being based in relational dynamics and relationships, absolutely, that's one of the reasons why this isn't quick work. This is difficult, these are thorny solutions. This is not quick work. This is, it takes a long time. It takes a lot of energy. It takes a lot of, goodwill to do this work. And I'll just lastly say that I was just listening to a podcast with Mariam Kaba, who's a transformational justice activist. And there was something that stood out to me when she mentioned that, that a lot of her work in rethinking approaches to criminal justice reform and safety and security was based in this idea of shrinking the space between her values and her actions. And she made the point that, this is a lifelong process and also one that's not linear. And so, that really stuck with me in thinking about, when we are trying to think of new solutions, that, being as inclusive as possible. It's not about, laying out step A, B, C, and that's where we know we're going to end up. And that's where we know the solution is going to, we can not always predict how we are going to learn about the solution, and then, what it's going to take to actually implement it.
Thanks, Lindsay. So actually, I want to dive deeper into some of what's been raised already. So something that you all have raised, and really just right now, Lindsay in particular, is that different people in different communities feel secure in different situations. So the example that we've been talking about, the presence of police makes some people, particularly Black people, other people of color, as well as trans people, other members of communities that have been targeted by the police, feel less safe. And at the same time, the white Jewish community has long relied on the police and even is worried about angering the police. Though I'll say there's times in history when that hasn't been true, where white Jewish communities haven't trusted the police, and certainly have known about. We know that there's also white supremacy and anti-Semitism within the police. So it's complicated. And yet we have situations where for some people walking into the synagogue, the presence of a police officer might make them feel more comfortable. For other people, it makes them feel less comfortable. And we also know that there's extreme situations, which are unfortunately possible. And then there's the day-to-day. So one of my questions is how we balance the day-to-day with the exceptional, which unfortunately has become more common. So specifically, as we've already raised, when there's an active shooter situation, it's possible that the presence of a trained police officer or security guard might be crucial. And that's a rare situation, but just in the last few years, of course, we've had the murders in Pittsburgh and in Poway, as well as all of the other horrible gun violence that happens in America basically on a daily basis in schools and churches and nightclubs and everywhere else that people go. And at the same time, as raised, on a daily basis, the presence of police makes people of color feel less comfortable and less safe. And it's not only that it's a feeling, but actually it's, or it means the presence of police might mean that ordinary situations can end with lethal violence, that the police might react to what's really an ordinary situation, whether it's somebody driving or walking down a particular street or being in their house, or whatever, any of the many situations with lethal violence. So I'm wondering if we can just dive a little more deeply into how we balance the different ways that the fact that some people might feel more safe in a situation where other people feel less safe, and also how we balance the desire to protect the security of all of our people, both in day-to-day situations and in the extraordinary situations. So just going to keep flipping the order. So let's go Deborah, Susan, and then Lindsay.
Yeah. So here's the thing. Most synagogues in America do not have 24/7 security or police presence. It's economically probably not feasible. It's just not necessary. You tend to have it when you're going to have high holidays, funerals, large gatherings. So I think people who have fear and are more sensitive to their safety concerns, one way to deal with it is to make them feel in control of how am I going to respond if there is not a security person outside, let's say the worst happens and somebody comes in, am I prepared for how to react. And we saw even in Tree of Life, you know, the rabbi had been trained and congregations had been trained on how to handle active shooter. Our kids, unfortunately, I think it's just a travesty today that they have to be taught that, but that's part of the reality. So if you haven't done that kind of training, you know, there are organizations now, I know the CSS, the Community Security Services, they're specifically focused on training Jewish institutions volunteers, right? So you'd have a cadre of, if you're interested in doing that, of BJ members who get trained and can train others, so that people who, you know, as I said, are very sensitive to what ifs, would feel more control. And those are the kind of people who step up, you know, people who feel like they can come in and get to it. It's almost like, you know, we've been doing in my office, making sure that there's bystander intervention training. So if you see something on a subway and, you know, somebody being harassed because of who they are, you have techniques in your mind. So every day when I'm on the subway now, I feel better about it because I know exactly what I'm going to do if I start seeing an Asian person being harassed, right? It's the same thing. If I'm in my synagogue and, you know, somebody comes in and is going to violate our sacred space, I would know what to do, and that would calm me down. So there are things to do on that daily basis versus the extraordinary events that require more eyes and ears. And even when you're considering those eyes and ears, what are they going to look like? Do you need the deterrent of a uniformed officer who's got a gun, or just knowing that the security presence is there to respond if there is an active, you know, shooter situation? So somebody who's not identifiably security, but the congregation knows that that person or persons are there. So those, for me, those are big distinction. It depends on what's happening. And you have a large synagogue with, you know, physical presence. Most of the synagogues we deal with in New York are little steebles, or, you know, they don't have the wherewithal to have that, you know, constant security presence out there. So.
Yeah, I mean, I think Deborah's expertise and those comments are so valuable and so important. And I think readiness is really important today, and it's empowering, you know. So I really appreciate that. One of the things that that we recently had a bomb scare, just maybe a month ago, a little bit. And I was on my way to services, and we have guard. We're not, you know, we do have guards at every gathering. So services, we have James. And I'm on my way to services. I get a call from the FBI. There's been a terrible threat. But he says he's not going to do anything till tomorrow morning. So I said, so can I go? He said, yeah, you can go. Because I had a group of kids meeting me there. And, you know, it was like, okay, so I'll go. So I got there, and of course the FBI was there, James was there, everybody was ready, and the guy was arrested even before services were over. He's still in federal custody because it turned out it was real and he was horrible, but he called the FBI. So, you know, yeah, I know it's a crazy story, but he was dangerous, and he continues to be in custody, and he lived on our street, and it was pretty scary for everybody. And as much as we had prepared with conversations like this. So again, BJ, good for you. Oh my God, what great leadership. Well, we all know BJ is great, but thank you for doing this work now. And as much as the work that we did, it was like we hadn't done anything when this happened. we had to go through everything with the congregation. And what I learned from that experience was you cannot talk about this enough, and you have to be transparent. People are more scared of what they don't know than what they do know. And, you know, I think Lindsay, I think you really spoke beautifully to that notion of we can't have some people feeling safe and other people not feeling safe. We have to be smart enough and creative enough and use all of our tools enough to make sure everybody feels safe. So I really appreciated you lifting that up. And, you know, the lesson we learned was this is something in today's world, we revisit all the time. It's about relationship building. It's about talking about it. It's about being really transparent. And it's about having letting everybody know what strategies you have in place if God forbid something happens. Where's the safe house? Are there locks on the inside of the doors? I mean, you know, what does your security assessment look like? And has that gone out to the congregation? Again, you'd think we would have known this. We've been doing it for so long, and we had to do everything again because we had this threat just a few months ago. But because we had all of those things in place, it didn't take that long. And we were able to show we had a communication plan in place. We had our security assessment. We have little panic buttons. Our nursery school teachers wear panic buttons, you know, on their, you know, we do have those things that again, goes right to the police. So we have that police issue again, but I think that's something that we have to really talk about. We have to be involved in transforming the kind of militarized policing that we have today, and we have to do that and you know, that's the last thing I'll say because Jill brought it up. You know, I'm a poster child for what happens when you stand and protest the police in the Jewish community. You know, I got blasted again and again by everybody, the left and the right. You know, I couldn't make anybody happy, but it was important. It's important to protest the police, as scary as it is for us as a Jewish community, because the policing in America has to change for all of us to be safe. For all of us to be safe. So there are things that we can do to continue our relationship with the police and our conversations and building that relationship, but also let them know we're watching. You know, we're part of the civilian oversight that is calling them to be better.
Yeah, I would say, you know, even building on that, I'm reflecting on, you know, the fact that so many of our solutions have been built in response to our fears. And that's true, you know, across our society. And in particular in the Jewish community, we have to really understand where our reactions and where our both our reactions and our actions are being you know, driven by our fears, and understanding when are we unsafe, when are we uncomfortable, when are we you know, what are those tools to keeping our community safe. I think that this is a challenge, and understanding those nuances that are particular to the Jewish community is very important. And I think that there are also other communities that are dealing with some version of that as well, that, you know, we can look to, that we can be in conversation with, that we might even have members of our community, whether we're talking about BJ specifically or the Jewish community at large, that there are people and individuals who are part of multiple communities. So for example, just looking at you know, the challenges facing the Asian American community right now, that and you know, the facing the rise in anti-Asian hate crimes, and there are many activists who in that community that have been working towards you know, criminal justice reform, and looking at that, as well as understanding, okay, but how do we do that, and how do we have expansive notions and visions of how we keep our community members safe. So I just, you know, I think that there are, I don't think that this is a cut and dry issue for anyone. I think I'm also thinking about, you know, community-based programs in predominantly POC communities that are dealing with, you know, high levels of gun violence, as well as, so how do you deal with that, as well as create community programming that is not relying on police for safety, because that is not how they are going to keep their individual members safe. And so, you know, I've read a little bit about, there's American Indian Movement Patrol, which was started in the 60s, which was essentially, within the American Indian or Native American communities in the Midwest, and thinking about, okay, how do we approach community safety? I think, Deborah, your underlining of that idea of what are the other ways that we prepare ourselves to act in emergencies is very important, right? Like how do we feel prepared for everything that can go wrong, and and how do we just give ourselves more options?
Thanks so much. So first of all, you predicted one of the questions that came in the chat, which was about ways that we can protect ourselves and how we can prepare. There's one more specific question. So somebody asked whether we should be doing that, whether we should be preparing. And I think we heard loud and clear, yes. And there are ways that we can all prepare ourselves as a community. There was one very specific question that maybe I'll put to Deborah about specific things that we can do to protect ourselves, especially from outside shootings, like locks and security systems. And I think that you're probably the one who's dealt with that. So maybe you can just speak to that a little bit.
Yeah, I dealt with it not in my current role, but for those of you who don't know me, I was at the Anti-Defamation League for 18 years. And so we dealt with it there. But yeah, generally you can have, so you can have law enforcement come in and do a security assessment. They will look at the locks, they will look at the cameras. I think that's kind of an easy fix that any Jewish institution can do, but it does that, that will help but it's not going to go to the core of the safety issue that people are feeling. So, but there, as I said, there is training, and I think it can be effective in just keeping it conscious and people's parts. What Susan said is very true. Just because you do it one time doesn't mean it's enough. Your staff changes over, your congregants change over. It's a constant thing, and unfortunately, it just has to become part of our culture. But I was thinking about what Lindsay was saying. I will tell you, my first year, my office was open because of the increase of anti-Semitic incidents in the religious neighborhoods in Brooklyn. So I spent my first year really dealing with the fear in that community and trying to address it. This past year, I'd say 80%, 85% of my time has been working with the Asian American community. And it's just been fascinating to see how each community responds to things in a very different way. And some of it is generational. So Lindsay, you're absolutely right. Like what I see is the older Asian community, they want the cops in there and they want people arrested. The younger folks, not as much. They really want more of a restorative process, and they want to be more respectful of other people of color and not demonizing different groups. So it's really all of our communities right now are struggling with this. The key is a lot of this is just educating people. And I do believe the relationship thing between communities, between police and the communities they serve, that has to be a key element right now. Because the fear of so many people against police, it's very real. We need to acknowledge it, but I believe, and that there are things we can do to help that, and that it needs to be done, because right now the police are the mechanism. If there is a crime that you have to call and get that response, it's just reality right now. I think we will get to a new place because of the kind of advocacy that Lindsay and others are doing. But right now we need to figure out all kinds of different ways to break down the barriers between the traditional security mechanisms in this country and our public, particularly the most vulnerable in our public.
I want to actually jump off of that, and maybe Susan, maybe what you're going to say you'll incorporate into this, but I want to go into the question of calling the police that Deborah just raised, and I'll pose that to Susan and Lindsay, maybe in that order. So over the last number of years, there have been a lot of really highly publicized situations where neighbors or just neighborhood vigilantes or whoever calls the police on Black people who are barbecuing, walking down the street, just doing normal things that people do. And in some cases, those encounters have ended with police or neighborhood vigilantes murdering or injuring the people in question. So we've heard a lot of calls by activists never to call the police, even when there might be criminal activity that's happening, or if somebody's having a mental health crisis. And as Deborah mentioned, unfortunately, we don't always have the resources that we wish we had, particularly, let's say, for mental health. And so I'm wondering if you can talk a little, and Susan, you mentioned a situation, well, actually, you mentioned a situation where you didn't call the police. It sounds like the perpetrator called the police on himself, which is unusual. But so I'm wondering if you can just talk a little bit about calling the police. When do you call the police? When don't you call the police? What kind of considerations go into that decision? So maybe Susan and then Lindsay afterwards.
Yeah, I mean, we've had many situations where we've really had to struggle with that. And I can say that there have been many times that I have not called the police, that we've depended on social workers and mental health workers. And, it's risky, but, we do have, and I know New York has stuff like this too, but we are seeing a change in one of the most dangerous cities in America with cure violence in a few of our neighborhoods, this treating violence and gun violence as a disease, and, with people who are, kind of trained but not police to de-escalate situations. So we do have people in the congregation who are trained to de-escalate. And, that happened since Ferguson, that happened since 2014, when again, it was dangerous to call the police for certain people. It was dangerous. Police, since, again, I blame it on Ashcroft in Missouri, and, since 2001 and post 9/11 and the militarized police are told to, go home. They want to go home alive and to use force. That it's part of their training. And I think there's a lot of movement to change. We have a new mayor, and the new mayor has already instituted social workers doing drive-alongs with police officers, and it is already making a difference in de-escalating, because the police have a certain training and they're scared, and there's so many guns out there, and people are afraid of the police, and the police are afraid of the people, and there's just a lot of shooting. So I think the more that we depend on the de-escalators and we find other ways to de-escalate some of these situations and educate ourselves about how to do this and become part of that. And then the other thing I really want to say, which I think is so important, and I think, both Deborah and Lindsay, pointed to this. We have an opportunity right now, just as because of True, I got arrested for the Muslim ban. Thank you very much. I mean, I was proud to, but the Muslims, that when we had that bomb threat, the first community that showed up for us was the Muslim community here in St. Louis. Why? Because we show up for them. Just a few years ago, after George Floyd was killed, and you probably remember the whole deal with the McCluskeys, right? Pulling the guns on they're next door neighbors to my synagogue. And I couldn't be there that night. I just couldn't be there. Had something else going on. I couldn't be there. I must have gotten 50 texts from protesters saying that they were protecting CRC, because they knew that the alt-right was also out there, and they were out to torch the synagogue because we were next door to the McCluskeys, who were, pulling guns on the protesters. And so who protected us? The protesters. So the more we show up for each other, the more we build allyship with each other and show up for each other, I think the safer we'll be too.
Yeah, I think that was a beautiful response. I mean, I don't know if I have much more to add to that. I mean, I know I don't have, the specific resources to New York City on hand, but I know that there's more and more being shared about, what are the alternatives to calling police. And I've even seen like a flow chart that can, okay, you're in crisis, or you see something, and, questions to ask yourself, okay, is someone in immediate physical danger? is someone having a health crisis, all the, that can help us determine what is the appropriate help to seek.
Yeah, so, right now in New York City, the only official mechanism is to call 911 if you're the victim of or you witness a hate crime. We've tried to do some education about the difference between hate crimes and bias incidents. There's a lot of bias incidents that happen. Those are the name calling on the street, the harassment without any physical. And we have the City Commission on Human Rights who can enforce human rights law. And so calling 311 to report those incidents are really important. My office has been, doing a lot of thinking and working with the community-based organizations to, are there other ways that we can do this? If somebody's not comfortable calling 911, can they still report to one of these advocacy organizations like the Anti-Violence Project here and use them as a mediator to report what's happening so that they don't have to have the direct contact with police? Those things, those are the kinds of things we're doing. You mentioned earlier, Lindsay, the patrols and whatnot. We're funding now, like in the Asian community, neighborhood safety patrols, similar to what the Jewish community has with Shomrim, the people who know their communities, who are out there, that people feel comfortable letting them know that something has happened. But it is frustrating because, that right now, that's the way to do it. And there are many who just are not. We know that hate crimes are vastly, vastly underreported. I actually think a lot of the numbers we're seeing, the huge rise in the Asian community, is a combination that these incidents are happening, but also the Asian community is now feeling more comfortable reporting. Like the Jewish community historically, as we've said, didn't, back in the day, did not have that trust relationship with law enforcement. Today we do. And we're probably, of all the vulnerable community, quote unquote, vulnerable communities, we report more than anything. Jewish people have very, I have seen a little bit of some people saying they're not going to report because of their concern for police and how they treat people of color. But for the most part, our numbers are high because we report. And our numbers are high because a lot of the incidents are vandalism, swastikas. Close to 70% of the anti-Semitic incidents in New York are those kinds of incidents. But those, even if a lot more of it's happening, if somebody's not calling 911, they don't get recorded. And data drives response, right? Yeah. We have the Stop Hate Act in Congress because the Asian community stepped up and said, look, we have the data now. We can show you the increase in anti-Asian hate crimes. Our community needs more funds to deal with this. We have millions of dollars flowing into the Jewish community for Homeland Security grants because the Jewish community felt comfortable doing it. I will put aside my church state hat. For years, I did not agree with that, but that's the reality today, right? The advocates who care about security in a certain traditional sense are stepping up and saying, we want more funds to do more of this kind of work. So it's fascinating. So those data points and the basic reporting structures right now, at least in New York City, is that if those incidents are not called in to 911 or reported to a local precinct, they didn't exist. That's just the reality.
Thank you. There's a couple of questions in the chat, and this might be our last question. We'll see how we do, but there's a few questions about police culture. So specifically, one person mentioned that police have been dangerous to Black people since back in the day when they were effectively slave patrols to go out and try to capture enslaved people who had escaped. And throughout, we could come up with just a million examples throughout American history. And so I'm wondering how you think about policing overall, meaning is policing an institution that can be repaired or is it too broken? And we see that there are some organizations, both in the Jewish world and beyond, that do a lot of training for police. So anti-bias training, training in noticing sex trafficking, or other kinds of labor trafficking, right? There's a lot of organizations out there that are doing training for police, really specifically anti-bias training, whether anti-Semitism or racism or et cetera, et cetera. And then there are others who say, you know what, it's not even worth it. It's not possible because the culture is too broken. So I'm wondering what you can tell us about that. And let's do Lindsay, Susan, and then Deborah.
Yeah, I mean, I think one thing that's really important is, not straying away from the systemic part of this conversation, because it's not just about, as how I am treated as an individual in my, whatever individualized interactions with the police officer day to day. It's also about, how are we investing into a system that systemically, harms people of color. And to me, that's part and parcel of the conversation about how we engage in safety and security in the Jewish community. And so I think that just one point that I want to make in addition to that is that, there's a broad range of opinions and perspectives and experiences across the Jewish community about this. And, in the spaces that I am inhabiting, I would even point out that even amongst people of color, Jews of color, there's a broad range of backgrounds and perspectives. Even amongst people who are Black and Jewish, there's a broad range. I mean, I'm thinking about, and this was something I shared with the panelists in our prep call, but I was recently talking to a friend who's Black and Jewish, and they were telling me about attending a conversation at their synagogue with another Black and Jewish friend about security and safety. And they, showed up, and the friend was completely, ended up leaving the conversation early because they were somewhat turned off by the conversation. It seemed like the conversation started to address security and safety on a broad level, but soon devolved into a conversation that was mostly about gun control, right? And about the use of guns to signify safety and to achieve safety within the synagogue. And it was a northeastern urban synagogue. There was a trend. The conversation trended to a generational agreement that guns in the synagogue was bad, and that safety that included guns was not good. And between those two Jews of color, there were two different experiences, and the person who left, was someone that grew up in a military family, was very comfortable with guns, owned guns themselves. And they said, this conversation is completely ignoring the topic of how the impact of police brutality on Black bodies. And that is what is most relevant to me in this conversation right now. And when I show up in my community, and if we're not going to talk about that, then this is not a conversation that I need to be a part of. So I think that that's just, that I share that anecdote as just to make that point of, that there are a lot of nuances in this conversation, and it is important. So I'm glad that we are pointing to that, the next level up, which is how do we interact with or wrestle with that question of how do we address those, policing as a systemic issue that affects our society. When we talk about reforming police departments, I mean, it's also about talking about culture change. Culture change, we know, in general is hard. It's very hard to do, and it takes a very long time. And on top of that, and talking about police departments, the genesis of creating them is, they were born out of marginalization and oppression. And so I don't know what the answer to your question is, but that makes me very concerned, the facts that I just said. So I don't know if police departments are able to be reformed, but I will say, from what has been tried in the past, the sort of, ad hoc approach and the tinkering approach, that to me does not work. And I'm more interested in thinking about and exploring, transformation in order to achieve, liberation.
One of the things in Lindsay's letter says that we have to have a more just allocation of resources. Unfortunately, that got translated into defund the police, which really makes a lot of white people really scared. It doesn't mean to defund the police departments right now. I think we all recognize that we have to have some kind of shoter system that grows to be more of a shomer system, where police officers get different kinds of training, where they are servants of the people. Once again, we just convicted a group of police officers that during a protest beat up an undercover police officer who was Black because they could. It's just, there's a lot of problems in policing across America, and the culture, it just is, and it has to change. So what can we do? I'm the founding rabbi of my congregation, 37 years old, but not me, the congregation. But the founder of my congregation is a man named Roger Goldman. Roger Goldman has spent his whole life, over 50 years fighting to get accountability into policing, because there are a lot of bad cops that can go from one place to another. And there had to be a way that was where the police weren't policing themselves. And so finally, last year, federally, we got something passed that said that there's a database of bad cops, so that bad cops can't get jobs once they get fired in one place because they've done something terrible. They can't get hired in the next precincts. The other thing that is beginning to change is we're starting to see, as Lindsay pointed out, the systemic pressure of police departments that have to make their budgets by profiling. I mean, in St. Louis, we have 91 different municipalities. They make their budgets by profiling people of color because they have broken taillights. And these are prescriptions for problems. There are hundreds of things like that need to change. Can we change them and change the culture of policing? It's a lot to change. Do we scrap it and start all over again? Thank goodness there are smart people like Brittany Packnett Cunningham, who also comes from St. Louis. I know her father, he was a minister. I watched her grow up, and now she's working on this 21st century policing. Not no policing, but a different kind of policing. That serves everybody. That isn't there to, Felicia started out by reminding us about the Torah portion. We had the chutzpah to leave that narrow place, right? Because we wanted a new paradigm where there wasn't us and them, where there weren't masters and slaves anymore. And this is part of our work. As Jews, our work is to come up with a new paradigm, because this paradigm is not working. It's not working. It's not working for people who aren't in the majority. And it's not working for the police officers who are good cops. It's not working for the police officers that got into this because they believe in public safety and being shomrim, being guardians of our safety. So, hopefully we will continue to have these courageous and difficult conversations, and people like the people at BJ who have privilege and who have connections and can call a Deborah Lauter and get her on a panel, right? And get Jill Jacobs to moderate it. You guys have the power. You've got people who listen to you, and you can demand that it looks better. And we're counting on you to do it.
So I'll end mine on, I'm an optimist. I totally acknowledge the systemic problems, but I believe we can get to the heart of it. When I get the most discouraged, I think of the estimated 21 million people who marched during the George Floyd protests. I mean, I think people are waking up, and I totally agree with Susan. I mean, I work with a lot of police officers. It's just, you know, I work well with community groups, but my role is to bridge the gap between community groups and police. And, you know, I had said to somebody earlier when we were preparing, you know, I went to Berkeley, right? And for me, cops equal pigs. That was my stereotype. These were not friends. And over the course of my career, I've spent a lot of time with law enforcement. And the majority of the people I deal with on the one-to-one basis and the ones who went into it do it for the right reasons. I am optimistic that we can address and correct a lot of the abuses in the system. I think the anti-bias training, Jill, to your question, I have seen it work. I also think, you know, the kinds of people that are hired to be in, there could be more screening of the kind of people that enter law enforcement, and getting more people, more women, more people of color who are, you know, recruiting them to be part of the change. I'm optimistic. I think there's no turning back on this. There has to be accountability to those of us who are taxpayers and want to see these changes made. It just has to happen. So to the extent we can do this bridging of, you know, police community relations, find things that work, scale up the models that we have seen work, I'm pretty optimistic that we're going to see significant changes.
So we have to end with apologies to all the people who've asked questions or made comments in the chat. I know there's going to be a lot more conversation in the community. I just want to end by doing a quick lightning round to ask each of our panelists to just tell us one sentence that you're hoping this community will take away. So really one sentence. And we'll start with Deborah, since you're already unmuted, and then Susan, and then Lindsay is the longest time BJ member here.
Well, it's one of those, I guess my one sentence is that you're doing the right thing, struggling with these questions and trying to make things better, and just kol hakavod for what you're doing. I'm glad to continue to engage in these conversations. Thank you.
Beautiful. So I could just echo what Deborah said, you know where you're vulnerable, have a communication plan, build allies in your neighborhood and across the city, and keep the conversation open, and don't let the tensions get squashed. Have those courageous conversations with each other and keep pulling Lindsay home. And thank you. Thank you for doing this important work. We'll be watching to see where it takes you.
Yeah, I'm afraid I squandered my privilege as a longstanding BJ member. I don't know if I have if I was able to come up with a sentence in those 2 minutes, but I generally, you know, this is a long-term conversation and a long-term challenge. So to me, being part of a community like BJ that's willing to invest in these spaces and invest in these conversations and help us all build resilience through discomfort, to me is where we start.
Thank you. And thank you to all of you. And I'm going to hand this back over to Felicia.
Thank you. Thank you to Jill and Susan, Deborah, and Lindsay. Just a lot of gratitude for being here this evening, and also your day-to-day efforts in trying to give us the safety and also have the imagination to build a different kind of world. I just wanted to say a couple of things. Just on the basic front, we do have a plan. We have been evaluated. It's important that people know that. And Susan reminds us that we need to communicate well about that. Because of COVID, we haven't been in person in a collective way in a long time. And so there was a period of strong assessment. We're still in that process of the things about the doors and all those things. So none of that has gone unchecked and is not in process. So I just want people to know from a kind of assessment phase that we've done that work. And if folks have further questions about that, it's not all complete, but we'll speak to Colin about being able to find the right communications. We did a number of that following Pittsburgh, and we'll continue to do that. Please God, we have the merit to be back together as a collective community in person. So I think it's important to say that. The second thing is important to say that I think also we have explored models, particularly around issues around homelessness, about not going right to the police, that it's important that we recognize a lot of the brokenness that's living on our streets is due to mental health and poverty. And so there are a lot of questions that have been raised about how do we respond to questions of folks sleeping on our steps. And those really hard questions have not been simple either. And also as well as the questions of homelessness that have been in our neighborhood. So I just want to honor the fact that this is not in one space or another. It's a collective recognition that we live with complicated problems that don't have quick solutions, and that we're committed to exploring the discomfort and learning in the discomfort, which is part of why we're having this panel tonight. And I want to also say that we've had many conversations one-on-one or with our collective staff in the community to understand lived experience of walking into BJ and being a part of BJ. And I can tell you also that people have resigned from BJ's membership because we've had police outside. And I suspect if we didn't have police outside, we would have people resign our membership. So there are a lot of strong feelings and a lot of diversity of experience. And I just want to also say, it's an agitating, broken, painful thing to hold. One, how broken our world is. Two, how much trauma we have as Jewish people about our victimization as a community. And three, that our Jewish community, which contains lots of different kinds of people, not all lived experience is the same, and that we're hurting people as much as we're trying to protect folks. And that is a structural and systematic nature of the way our society has been built. And nothing is going to get solved in a day. And so we are committed to really living into the discomfort, and also not suppressing the tension and not hiding from the conversation and not exposing that history or the structure, also all the threat. And so we want to be honest about that and walk courageously through that. And obviously, these aren't only theoretical questions, they're real day-to-day decision makings that we're trying to live through faithfully. And finally, before I just hand it over to Shuli to close, is to say that we care that everyone feels safe. That is our utmost priority, is that no matter who walks in through our doors, who works in our building, who rents space from us and lives in our building, our commitment is to that collective notion of physical and emotional and spiritual safety, which is hard to achieve, but we are committed to having an imagination to dream and not feel stuck, that there's no way forward. So I'm going to turn it out now to Shuli, and thank you again to everyone.
Thank you, Felicia. I want to just say three things in closing. First is to echo the gratitude, the thank yous to all four of you, Jill, Susan, Deborah, and Lindsay, for being here, giving of your time, your wisdom, your expertise, and being part of a conversation that, as we've all acknowledged, is really not easy to have. This is the reason why we're having this conversation, is for this generation and the
Me?
next generation, to be able to live in
I
a
thought that you guys
in a
were
different-
talking about dead people.
in a different world.
Please.
Okay, give me five.
And
give me-
George Floyd.
So thank you. Thank you.
You're welcome.
The second thing I want to say is I appreciate very much your kudos for our having this
know.
conversation tonight, but this is the easy part.
Kudos,
The
what's
easy
that?
part is sitting here and listening to you and
That's not easy.
thinking about things.
I don't
The
know if
harder
thank you.
part is what's coming. And that is opportunities for BJ members to be in smaller conversations with one another about these issues, that relationship building work, figuring out what is a next step. It's not A, B, C, as Lindsay said. We don't know what the path is. We don't know where we're going to land. And that's the hard part. So please, BJ members, look out for information about opportunities to come together
Watch out for guns.
in conversation later this month and later in the winter. And we hope that you will choose to be part of this and do the hard work. The last thing I want to just acknowledge is that this series, this conversation tonight and this series has been part of our Shemitah programming, recognizing that we are in the Jewish calendar in a Shemitah year, which is a year of living in the tension of the world as it is and the world as we want it to be in its best self and best possibility, the world as it is and the world as it should be, and a year of reimagining. And we have, I think, heard tonight some of the wonderful ways that we've been trying, people like you, Susan, have been trying to reimagine, and people like you, Lindsay, have been trying to reimagine and push other communities to reimagine what can things look like? What can things look like today? What can things look like a year from now? And not wait until we get to that final world as it should be. That's how it has to be. But where do we do the work along the way? So thank you for giving us those windows into the reimagining. And we very much look forward to continuing this thinking and this dialogue with all of you and with our members as well. So thank you everyone for joining us tonight. And we will see you soon. Stay safe, stay warm. Good night, everyone.
Good night.